Hello, my friends. Welcome to today's show. And if you've been listening to the podcast or anything I've been involved with for any period of time, you'll know that I think that the irrational fears surrounding kidnapping and trafficking of children is pernicious and dangerous for the development of kids and your mental health. If you're really sitting there worried that your kid is going to get kidnapped, well, then you're not going to let your kid out. And if you don't let your kid out, well, then they're not going to be a very courageous, independent, or confident adult. Because, of course, they're going to think that there's danger around every corner. Over the years, I've talked to Lenore Skenazy, a free-range parent, and so many more experts about this issue. Talked about how I raised my daughters, why I think these issues matter so much. In addition, there is now a statistic that has so many American parents terrified that 800,000 kids are kidnapped and sold into sex trafficking every year. Guess what? Couldn't be further from the truth. I'm not downplaying kidnapping or sex trafficking. When it happens and it's legitimate, it's terrible. It's any parent's nightmare. But as I've always said many times, you probably don't know anybody who's been kidnapped. You probably don't know anybody who knows anybody who's been kidnapped. We can name the people who were. Elizabeth Smart, when I was growing up, it was such a big story out in Utah, of course. Which is why I was so interested to talk to Vice News' Anna Merlan, because she, along with her colleagues at Vice News, has been doing an excellent job reporting out the story about this movie, The Sound of Freedom, and the organization and man it's based on, Operation Underground, and Tim Ballard, who I interviewed back in 2013 at SiriusXM. Well, Operation Underground has spent years making big, often unprovable claims about its paramilitary missions and role in rescuing trafficked kids. It would seem they've outright fabricated some of their stories, if not exaggerated or manipulated them to make it seem like they are and he is somebody that they're not. And now this stupid movie, The Sound of Freedom, has awakened the passions of a broad swath of right-wing conspiratorial world most vulnerable to these beliefs. Religious influencers, QAnon fans, a huge group of people who defy easy categorization, my guest Anna Merlan writes, have all thrown their support behind Sound of Freedom. While fans of the movie have insisted that it's, quote, raising awareness, a global problem, experts in trafficking, actual experts, many of which are also victims, people who have experienced it themselves, are finding it's contributing to serious and harmful misinformation about what trafficking looks like and what survivors need to recover. Since the release of this film, Sound of Freedom, survivors have criticized the film, has been frequently accused themselves of being pedophiles or groomers, the kinds of people by whom they themselves were once victimized. It's a terrible story, terrible outcomes, and frankly, it really pisses me off, and we need to correct the record, which is why I brought on Vice News' Anna Merlan to talk to me about it. Excellent reporting and a great, great interview I did, if I do say so myself. That is coming up at about 11 minutes in after the news. But now a word from our announcer, Pete Coe.
Hey there, stand-up listeners. If you like what you hear on this podcast, consider being a paid subscriber on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get all the witty, insightful, and enlightening conversations with amazing guests ad-free. More importantly, you'll also gain access to our Discord chat server and an amazing community of listeners from all across the country and around the globe. Last but not least, you'll be able to join our online hangouts, hosted by Pete himself, where regular podcast guests often jump on and answer listener questions. Sign up now at patreon.com/Pete Dominic, or go to standupwithpete.com and click on the big red button that says Support Stand Up.
All right. Thank you very much, Pete Coe. And now it's time to give you that news update I give you Monday through Thursday here at the top of the show. Some headlines, some clips, and then on to my conversation with a really great first-time guest, Anna Merlan of Vice News. First, I do want to mention that Julia told me tonight that there's a blood shortage, so I love that she's on top of that. She knew about that news before I did, but the blood supply in the United States has fallen nearly 25% since early August. The Red Cross is blaming climate disasters for the blood shortage. Hurricane Idalia, which made landfall in Florida last month, caused more than 700 units of blood and platelets to go uncollected. Donor turnout last month also dropped after one of the busiest travel seasons on record, along with back-to-school activities contributing to a shortfall of 30,000 donations. So please go find a local blood bank and give. If you've never done it before, maybe think about it. It's the best thing. It makes me feel good every time I do it. So I hope that you'll consider making a difference there. Other big news yesterday, of course, the death toll in Morocco now surpassed 2,800 as of Monday night, 3 days after this powerful earthquake hit Morocco. Rescuers are beginning to reach some of the hardest hit areas and remote mountain villages, but many more settlements are still waiting for assistance. Just horrible, horrible situation there. And in other news, the FDA approved new COVID shots. The FDA gave the green light to a new round of COVID boosters, the first to be approved since the public emergency ended in May. And the move is coming as the Biden administration is preparing a campaign to convince Americans to get immunized. Good luck. Good luck to the Biden administration as COVID cases tick up. The boosters are set to arrive alongside the seasonal flu vaccine and shots to protect infants and older adults from RSV. I think I mentioned on the podcast yesterday that Mom is getting all three of them. She's getting the triple cocktail. She can't wait to get vaccinated, and I hope that you'll get them all as well. COVID hospitalizations and deaths in the U.S. rising slightly, although not the numbers of past years. But in the week ending on August 26th, there were 17,400 people admitted to the hospital, more than 6,000 at a low point this summer. And deaths reached roughly 600 a week last month. That was far lower than the weekly average of 14,000 deaths back in 2021, but still a crazy amount. And you're about to have fewer sweet treats available at the grocery store. I'm just making that up, but I saw this headline: Twinkies and jam to mix as Smucker's buys Hostess for $5.6 billion. J.M. Smucker, the maker of jellies, Jif peanut butter, and Uncrustables, agreed to take over of Hostess brands, adding Twinkies, Ho-Hos, and Ding Dongs to its portfolio of snacks. And I just felt like I needed to read all of those words to you to make your day. That's a lot of money. $5.6 billion. I mean, I always wonder about companies like that. If you're a corporate executive, whether it be a creative type or a marketing type, and you're like, yeah, I work for Jif peanut butter. Yeah, I come up with like new marketing ideas for how to sell jelly and ding dongs. Just always, I'd like to meet somebody who does that someday, just to say I did. All right, well, bad news for Drew Barrymore, well, I think at least. The Writers Guild of America members and others are picketing outside CBS studios in New York on Monday because the daytime talk show resumed filming amid the writers and actors strike. And two audience members, at least, who signed up for free tickets to the taping were handed WGA pins by picketers as they walked in the door. They were asked to leave before the show began because they were wearing the pins. How about that? So really not looking good for her reputation. I don't know what she's thinking doing that. She's like America's sweetheart, and she's crossing the picket line. I mean, she must have thought that through. I saw at least one prominent actor, Bradley Whitford, on Twitter saying, we're not going to forget this Drew Barrymore. So, ugly situation it's becoming with all of these strikes, including for me, man, not working on HBO's John Oliver since back in April. One other big story worth mentioning. Yesterday, news broke that the United States has moved to advance a prisoner swap deal with Iran and release $600 billion of their own money. So we're not paying them. The Biden administration has cleared the way for the release of 5 American citizens detained in Iran by issuing a blanket waiver for international banks to transfer $6 billion in frozen Iranian money from South Korea to Qatar without fear of U.S. sanctions. In addition, as part of the deal, the administration has agreed to release 5 Iranian citizens in the United States. So that'll be fun criticism of the Biden administration that we're, I'm sure, going to hear, even though the Trump administration did the same thing many times. All right, well, that's all the news I've got for you. Sorry I didn't get any clips today. It was a crazy day, but very excited that tomorrow I'll be interviewing comedian Todd Barry and Kelly Carlin, George's daughter. I'm going to be talking to her as well as releasing some more of my interviews from Iowa, including my conversation with State Senator Zach Walz. We're very busy over here in the shed at Stand Up with Pete Dominic. And today's show, I should mention, is also brought to you by Kevin Richburg's sweet honeybee nectar. That's right. You can buy yourself, listener Kevin Richburg's honey right now for $20. The link is in the show notes. He's got about 30 pounds left, and I promise him that the stand-up audience would buy this honey. He'll ship it to you from anywhere to almost anywhere in the country, I think. And of course, His farm, Slate Hill Edible Forest, that he started is in upstate New York, where I grew up. Kevin's been a great friend to me and my family, and I want to support him. He needs the money, and you need the honey. The By Kevin Richburg Sweet Sweet Nectar. Right now, go to SlatehillEdibleForest.com to find out more about Kevin and his farm, and there's a link to buy that honey on all of my social media and in the show notes of today's episode. All right, well, let's get now to my guest. She's a journalist and author specializing in subcultures, alternative communities, conspiracy theories, crime, belief, death, sexual violence, and women's lives. Currently a reporter at Motherboard, a division of Vice News. She's previously a reporter at the Special Projects Desk and Investigation Division within Gizmodo Media Group. He was a senior reporter at Jezebel, a staff writer at the Village Voice and the Dallas Observer. Her work has appeared in Rolling Stone, BBC, Travel, Topic, and the op-ed page of the New York Times. She's also been accused of being both a lizard person and a CIA agent, but never at the same time. Her new book is Republic of Lies, which looks really interesting. I'm going to get that. American conspiracy theorists and their surprising rise to power. Follow her on social media, Anna Merlan. AnnaMerlan.net for the first time. Senior staff writer at Vice, talking about Tim Ballard and his Underground Railroad organization that the movie Sound of Freedom is loosely based on. Really important reporting and an excellent journalist. Had a great conversation. Welcome to the show, Anna Merlan.
Anna Merlan joins me, and I can't believe it's the first time. It's one of those things where you're like, I can't believe I'm just discovering this person's work when this is kind of what I do for a living. It's my fault. You've been out there working for a long time. I'm super excited to get you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So lots to talk about with you on today's show. I originally obviously reached out to you because I wanted to find someone to talk to about Tim Ballard's work and this movie, Sound of Freedom. But then I realized you've been covering kind of this beat for a long time. You even wrote a book on the issue titled Republic of Lies. So tell me a little bit about your background and your work for listeners who aren't familiar with it. Now we'll all become fans and supporters of yours.
Or become someone else who yells at me on Twitter, which is
not this
completely
audience,
fine.
I don't think.
Whatever.
Not our audience.
So I have been a journalist for, at this point, I think about 15 years, and have been covering the anti-vaccine movement with a special focus for like 10 years, roughly. And so my kind of beat is that I write features, I write long stories, but I started focusing really heavily on conspiracy culture in 2016. At the beginning of 2016, I went on this cruise for conspiracy theorists that was supposed to be like a light, kind of fun piece for Jezebel, where I worked at the time. And
just to be clear, you went on a cruise that was for conspiracy theorists, but you were there as a journalist. Were you openly like saying you're a journalist, or were you undercover?
No, it's very for lots of reasons that we could get into. It's very rare for journalists to go undercover anymore, and the sort of ethics around that have shifted. So no, I personally wouldn't do that unless it was absolutely necessary. No, there were 3 journalists on the boat, me, a woman named Bronwyn Dickey, who is writing for Popular Mechanics, and our friend Colin, who is a blogger who was there for his wife's website. He's a blogger and a lawyer and a law professor, and then a photographer named Dina Latovsky, who was there with Bronwyn. And we have all become really good friends because it was it was really stressful. It was one of those things that I just did not go into it totally prepared. And kind of the things that I learned on the cruise and the dynamics that I saw completely changed the focus of my work. And I started focusing really heavily on conspiracy culture, how it causes people to make decisions, how we choose who to trust, the sort of financial elements of this world, because there were several financial experts self-styled on the boat, 2 of whom were arrested getting off the boat, and then the 3rd of whom was arrested later. So they all ended up going to prison for the financial advice that they were offering, because they were, it turns out, what is called redemption theorists, which is a kind of branch of sovereign citizenry that focuses on their very unique understanding of the tax code. So yeah, basically since 2016, my sort of primary focus has been on kind of conspiracy culture, which obviously now is a pretty crowded beat. That's, that's not as maybe unusual as it was, 10 years ago. So it's been an interesting few years, especially with COVID.
Is it easy for you to evaluate how the conspiracy movements, conspiracy theories, conspiracy culture has waxed or waned, has grown or lessened? I mean, it would seem obvious that it's only gotten far worse and more, I would say, radical, hard to believe conspiracies have become more believable as a result of the way you can spread a lie, technically.
Yeah, I mean, we're living in super polarized times. COVID specifically, I think, created a lot more folks who were at least like receptive to medical conspiracy theories, not just about vaccines, but about sort of the overall like medical industry. So I'm seeing a lot more of that. But the other thing that tends to happen when you cover this stuff for a long time is that you see that there are a lot of kind of foundational ideas and kind of symbols in conspiracy theories that recur over and over and over again. So like one of my obsessions is tunnels, because there are so many conspiracy theories going back to the Middle Ages that involve tunnels and things that are underground. And you can do like a Jungian analysis of why that is, why people are obsessed with tunnels. But yeah, so I see new stuff, but I also see the same old stuff, specifically things that have roots in sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories from the Middle Ages that recur over and over again in different guises. And so, yeah, it's super interesting. I would not say it's made me like the most optimistic person in the whole world, but yeah.
I mean, I don't know how I can't imagine how it affects your judgment of things and people and the future when you're surrounded by it and covering it, I should say, with the granularity that you are. I don't know what kind of fortitude you would have to be resilient enough not to be affected by it.
Well, I don't know. I don't know how resilient I am. I don't know how resilient any journalist is after this period of time. But I will say that like everyone I know who manages to work in journalism for a long time and not burn out, it's because they have hobbies outside of journalism. They have like a happy home life. They have like something else going on. They play in like the media softball league or whatever. So, like if I talk to young journalists who are really beginning to be super traumatized, like I do tell them to quite literally like go outside and do something that involves touching grass. So, yeah, there are ways to not be driven crazy.
Yep, that's exactly how I feel. I guess I'm a journalist. I've been called a journalist by some journalists, but I don't do the kind of journalism that you do, and I don't like stolen valor. But I interview the smartest journalists in the world and have for a long time. And I guess the point is, I know all the bad things happening all the time, and so you got to find balance. So do people who listen to this show or other media outlets. You got to find your appetite to maintain your sanity and some sense of joy. So let's get to some of the things that you've covered, because I do, before I get to Tim Ballard's Sound of Freedom, I realize, and I don't know as much about your coverage of Sandy Hook and Alex Jones. You had a great op-ed that you wrote for the New York Times at one point. You talked about it, I think, in your book. Alex Jones picked on the wrong people is the title the New York Times gave this piece. But I feel like that's such... To me, that's the most outrageous of all of the things that we've seen, and maybe you can think of something more. But the way that Alex Jones certainly profited off the lies, the destruction of children who died. What could be worse? Nothing can be worse than losing your child. But one thing that can make it worse is someone telling you that you didn't lose your child. What did we learn about him and what happens when you traffic the way he does at the level he does?
Right. So the first thing is that, unfortunately, every mass casualty event now that generates a lot of coverage, especially if it happens in the U.S., is subject to conspiracy theories that it didn't really happen, that the people involved didn't really die, right? And of course, Alex Jones didn't invent what are called crisis actor conspiracy theories, but he was certainly like the biggest megaphone to spread them, which is partly why these families, eventually, reluctantly, decided to pursue legal action. They were pretty realistic about what it was going to do to their privacy, what it was going to do to the level of threats that they're already getting. And they chose to move forward because in their minds, as they talked about at trial, things got so much worse when Alex Jones got involved. It's one thing to have a very small, small-time person like, say, James Tracy or James Fetzer, two kind of prominent but lesser known kind of Sandy Hook truthers. It's one thing to have them involved, but it's another thing to have Alex Jones at the height of his reach talking about you, because in the period of time that he was doing the Sandy Hook stuff, this was when his audience was at its biggest. He was not deplatformed yet. He was making the most money I think he's arguably ever made. And, I have been like the subject of his show when he was already deplatformed, and it's already like pretty, it's pretty distracting. So I cannot imagine what it would be like for these parents who are grieving, who are not people who are by and large like knew a lot about conspiracy theories or media, and to have had to deal with that. So
or didn't sign up for it. Like, you're a journalist, you know that this is a possibility. These people lost their child and they became victimized even further and exploited.
Yeah, they did. And if you haven't read Elizabeth Williamson's book about Sandy Hook, it's really incredible. It's really kind of a masterpiece. It's about the families and about what they went through. And it's just very, very focused on them rather than on Alex Jones. It's beautiful. It's very hard to read. I had to put it down a few times, but it's very good. And she is a journalist at the New York Times who also covered the trial.
Sandy Hook, an American tragedy in the battle for truth. Elizabeth Williamson. Yeah.
Yeah, it's excellent. It's very, very good. It's very sad. And, she did the work of, getting these families to talk who were so traumatized from their experience with media. This is something that also kind of doesn't get talked about, is that like some of the Sandy Hook families had really intrusive experiences with journalists. Like the day their children died, they had people like trying to get into their houses under false pretenses and, photographing them every time they went outside. And it was really, it was a really, really, really tough landscape for them.
So we go from that horrible conspiracy theory and Alex Jones to some of the other things that you've been covering. And I want to get into this story about Tim Ballard, the Sound of Freedom, and his organization. As I think I told you in an email, I interviewed him in like 2013. I was trying to figure out when it was. And it was I was at Sirius XM and he was pitched. And so there's a certain vetting that goes into that, I thought. And I vetted him further, and, there wasn't a lot out there. And he seemed super interesting, former national security expert in the government. I bought it, all of it, and I interviewed him. But I knew then, because I do have a certain sense of people, that there was something off about him, that it seemed like he was making it a little bit too much about him. That's always something you can pick up on, of course. And you and your colleagues at Vice have done, I think, the best journalism on this guy. And I want to get into it, but I think just before we have to talk about the kind of disclaimers about the truth, if you can, if we will, about sexual trafficking, human trafficking, labor trafficking, and why it's a terrible thing, it's happening, and why it matters. But to me, the biggest problem that I've seen, Anna, is an insidious epidemic of parents who think their kids are going to get kidnapped. And this film, Sound of Freedom, only perpetuates it. There's a statistic that so many Americans believe that over almost 1 million kids have been kidnapped, and the classic terrifying way. And I believe that is so pervasive and spreads that it really affects people's behavior in so many ways. And I want to save them. There's a lot to worry about in the world, but this is not something that has to be on your mind. And so that's just kind of where I wanted to start. And I'm sorry I don't have a question for you to pick up on. But
I think that's so. First of all, the period of time that you interviewed Tim Ballard was the period of time when OUR was getting a lot of uncritical coverage.
You're welcome.
In mainstream news. Yeah.
You're welcome, everybody.
So it just all of which is to say, like, you were not the only person who was like, who offered him that kind of platform. That wouldn't be fair to say. So the second thing is that, parents are worried about their kids getting snatched for a couple reasons. One is that there is a huge industry to promote that point of view, and to oversimplify ideas about what trafficking is and what trafficking looks like. And the second is obviously, and this is only somewhat related, like in the US, you are really not allowed to allow your children to do things like, walk home from school by themselves or wait in the car for you in the, while you're in the grocery store, which is, I think, something a lot of us who are older grew up with, because you will get arrested, right? So there's a lot of things going on to create a sense of anxiety for parents about, allowing their kids to be alone. But the trafficking piece of it tends to come from a oversimplification of what trafficking is and what it looks like. So my colleague and editor, Tim Marchman, and I have written this series of stories about OUR and the anti-trafficking industry, and have talked to a lot of, experts, academics, people who work in government, people who work at NGOs, who deal with this problem every day. And the reality is that most people are trafficked by someone they know, a family member, a romantic partner, and trafficking doesn't look like throwing someone into a van and kidnapping them most of the time. That does happen. It's not to say it never happens, but a lot of times, folks that I've interviewed have been like, I did not realize I was being trafficked because the depiction that I saw was being thrown into a van. And what happened to me, like I interviewed somebody who was kicked out of his home as a teenager for being gay, was taken in by an older man who promised to take care of him, and then coerced him into sex work through a, kind of bogus massage business. And so this is much more common. People who have romantic partners or family members coerce them into commercial sex or labor. This is another thing that doesn't get talked about very much in the US, but labor trafficking is a huge issue by things like emotional or physical coercion, maintaining hold of their documents. Like there are all these ways that people are forced into trafficking situations that do not look like what experts we talk to always call the Taken scenario, the getting thrown into a van. And so Taken specifically really created people's sense of what they think trafficking looks like.
Yeah, it's a weird thing, too, because if you give the benefit of the doubt to the filmmakers, to Liam Neeson and everything of those movies, they could be like, this is a movie. It's just a movie. This isn't happening. There's not rich white girls being snatched by Saudi princesses and trafficked. Like, it's a movie, but I'm sad to hear you say that, but also it seems pretty obvious that people actually bought that. Like, really.
I haven't seen Taken. I really need to watch it.
You need to watch every single thing Liam Neeson does, I think, I would tell you.
Love him. Truly do. But yeah, I mean, so the interesting thing that's happened with Sound of Freedom is that when the filmmakers are sort of pressed on some of the less believable specifics of the movie, or when OUR is pressed on it, they say, well, it's a movie. And then the rest of the time they say, but it is based on a true story. And a lot of this really happened. And so they have, again, in my opinion, have sort of maybe tried to play it a little bit both ways, where when they get fact checked, it's a movie. And when they want to, rally the audience, then it is based on a true story.
Very well said, and probably one of the more important outcomes or questions, I think, of that film and the way they have it both ways. But you guys have a story at Vice where you reached out to tons of people who had been trafficked and are now working in organizations, nonprofits, NGOs to fight that. And they're being attacked and criticized and blamed and not being heard. That is everybody should read this. It should be the award-winning piece of journalism. Here it is, Trafficking Survivors and Advocates. I just lost it in my notes. Sorry, I was really nailing that. Trafficking survivors and advocates are being harassed by Sound of Freedom viewers, fans. Tell me what you learned, who you talked to in that article and what you learned. Give me some of the counts.
So a lot of the people I talk to are either trafficking survivors who now work in the anti-trafficking space, or they are longtime advocates who have worked, directly with people who are survivors of trafficking. And so they all had really complicated feelings about the movie, mostly negative. And when they have tried to talk online about their misgivings and their doubts about what the movie portrays, they literally get called groomers. They literally get told that they must themselves be child abusers, which, again, for people who in some cases have been groomed or sexually abused as minors, have overcome the difficulty of having that happen to you. It's pretty painful for them. And so what they said was, and experts in the anti-trafficking field have said this to us so many times, when people have this cartoonish idea about what trafficking looks like, they don't recognize it when they see it at home. Like, they don't recognize labor trafficking when they see it. And they don't think that they can help, So a lot of the groups that we talk to, I would be like, what do you need? And they would say, well, we have this group for survivors. It's a dinner. And we need people to drive these women, because that group was all women, to this dinner. And we need reliable childcare so these women can focus on the work that's happening at these dinners and not have to take care of their kids for an hour. And that's very simple. Or like, hey, we need someone to go through the clothing closet. We need someone to do some filing. But these things are not sexy. And busting down a door or, freeing someone from a cage seems very exciting. And so some folks who are really drawn to the Sound of Freedom narrative are less likely to want to participate in these ways that are maybe a little bit more, they're just less exciting. They're more kind of like day to day.
Well, at the end of Sound of Freedom, there's an ask by Jim Caviezel, apparently, I haven't seen it, for people to tell people to go buy tickets, to go see this movie, when you could have easily made a massive difference. Millions of dollars could have been raised for the 10 organizations that scrolled up that were actually, that they could have linked to in that movie, promoted in that movie, but instead they just promoted themselves. And the truth is, it really does all look like a grift, a scam. You guys have done great reporting on the organization, the Underground Railroad organization, and Tim Ballard, who recently just stepped away. Your reporting on this shows a lot. The bottom line to me is when a journalist like you reaches out to corroborate a piece of biographical information of Tim Ballard or ask about the organization and doesn't get the right response, well, then they're lying to us. I mean, there's tons of organizations that would answer a journalist question, perfectly fine question that you're asking about the record, about where they worked, and you would give that record for a politician, a business leader. That's not the cooperation that you got, is it?
So we had an interesting experience with OUR. In fairness, their spokespeople have worked with us on some of our queries, not all of them. So basically what happened was my editor, Tim Marchman, and I, who I'll call Marchman because we're also talking about Tim Ballard and it gets confusing. Marchman and I first read about OUR because our colleague, David Bixenspan, who writes about wrestling, wrote this thing about a WWE referee's support for OUR. And we were like, there's a lot of claims being made that we are curious about. And so I think the first thing Marchman did is he just reached out and asked for a list of countries where OUR works. And we started sort of looking at what the organization did, not with any particular aim, just with a sort of sense of curiosity and a sense that maybe there's more to the story. And then literally like a week or two later, we learned that they were under investigation in Utah by a Utah county attorney named Troy Rawlings. Started this investigation, which has since been closed.
Right.
No charges have been filed. We do know that the investigation ultimately and also involved federal agencies, including the FBI, but the investigation is closed. No charges were filed. That did not come to anything. So in the course of looking into OUR for our first story, a couple things happened. The first was that we talked to a bunch of domestic law enforcement agencies who told us that they had stopped working with OUR because they started to feel like OUR would, in some cases, give them a very small amount of money and then take credit for domestic operations. And so, or just, these law enforcement agencies had become aware that OUR was somewhat controversial and they decided that it was like not worth the trouble. The other thing was that we found what would prove to be a really consequential story for us, which was the true story of this woman that OUR has referred to as Liliana, who is a trafficking survivor and who OUR's version of how they intervened in her life is just flatly not true. And we were able to figure out what is true. So that was our first story.
And you were able to figure out what was true. Mm-hmm. And the case was they didn't save her. They didn't rescue her. She rescued herself. She escaped herself. And this isn't necessarily an uncommon narrative, but that's what I mean. I mean, for me, that's it. When I read your reporting, that they misrepresented that they were the savior, arguably white savior in a lot of cases, of a young girl who they weren't. That's it for me, Anna. As in terms of credibility, you lied about saving a kid that you didn't save, thus taking agency from that young girl and probably other people who might be somehow taken or detained in any way. It's a terrible thing to do and should destroy your credibility entirely. At least it did with me, but maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I should be more sympathetic to the organization.
I think that OUR and Mr. Ballard would argue that they helped her in some way that we have not been able to get them to talk about in detail. They certainly didn't rescue her. That is not true. And they would probably argue that they have conducted other raids and rescues, especially in foreign countries, that they can't talk about due to operational security. That is my understanding of how they would convey the story of what OUR does. And you can see that I'm being very careful, both because I continue to want to be fair to them. This is ongoing work. We are writing a new series of stories about them this week and continue to welcome their feedback and their comment. But also because they have made so many claims over the years that it has been hard to run them down. I feel like we're still 3 years in, we're still kind of peeling the onion,
I hope that you'll keep doing it and doing a great job at it. Just tell me one more detail about these operations. You write in depth. You've done investigations into the operations themselves. Some of the people who work there or formerly worked there, some former special forces people. And, one way to read it is that they're slapdash. They're unorganized. They're unprofessional. You could even say in some cases it looks a little bit like entrapment, that they go to some foreign country. They set out an operation. They put out bait of a child. They get someone to come. They snatch them. They take credit. They raise their profile. They raise money. I know I'm simplifying your reporting. And so pick any part of that you want to look at, because you write in detail about it in several articles, you and your colleagues.
Right. So people who previously worked with OUR, who are ex-military, raised concerns to us about what they saw as sort of like incomplete kind of intelligence gathering before they would do these missions. They viewed it as just sort of not up to the standards that they had. Like a really kind of basic example is one person said to us, like, they wanted to do this operation to, supposedly rescue these kids that they believed were being held, and they didn't know where the closest hospital was, which, like, for people who were ex-military is just unacceptable. So a bunch of people we spoke to were folks who had some connection with the Mormon community, because Mr. Ballard is a devout Mormon, and a lot of people involved in the world of OUR are also LDS. So a lot of these folks were ex-Mormons or ex-military and wanted to get involved in OUR because they really wanted to, make a difference. And so one of the more shocking things that we found that we've reported on, and that we have some more reporting to release soon, is that OUR relied really heavily on a psychic named Janet to give them intelligence that she was literally getting through her visions to direct some of these operations. And
imagine any kind of United States government, special forces or military operation regarding an intelligence gained from a psychic, then thus putting people in harm's way based on that. It's not only irresponsible, but it should be illegal, at least for a government organization. If these guys want to go do it, I guess they can. But
OUR defended the practice to us when we asked them about it. I think we published the story 2 years ago and said, police use psychics all the time, which is just not true. And even if it was true, it wouldn't make it a good idea. So we found a lot of stuff like this where there is what people involved in the organization felt was like an insufficient amount of sort of preparation. Experts also raised a much more sensitive question to us that I want to be careful about how I phrase, but several of them said that they were afraid that OUR and other similar organizations that do what's called the raid and rescue model could be inadvertently creating demand. Because one thing that we saw with OUR and with other similar organizations is an operation would look like going to a foreign country, let's say Mexico, and going to a club or a bar where they believed commercial sex work to be happening and asking for young women and then saying, no, I want them younger than that. I want them younger. And so what would happen often, according to people we spoke to, is that the supposed trafficker or pimp would say, well, I don't have that, but maybe I can get it for you. Which would mean then that you're not finding women or girls or children who are already being trafficked. You are potentially creating demand for people who previously were not involved in commercial sex work to be coerced into that. So that was a concern that many people raised to us. And it is actually something that you see in Sound of Freedom. You see the pimp trafficker figure sort of being like, well, I can't get that many underage girls, but if you wait, maybe I can get you some more. So this was something that concerned a lot of people that we talked to about this. And it's not sort of considered a best practice. And it's one reason why a bunch of sort of raid and rescue type organizations don't do that anymore. Like, it's fallen out of fashion for a reason.
For good reason, it would seem. And Tim Ballard is officially out of the organization, which raises a lot of questions that I don't think
out of two organizations. He's out of OUR and he's out of the Nazarene Fund, which is founded by Glenn Beck to help persecuted Christians, he says, and where Ballard was the CEO. So yes, he departed both organizations. We know from our reporting that there was an internal investigation that led to him leaving. And we hope very much that we can tell you more about that soon. We're working on that.
Yeah, you don't have any concrete facts on why he's left or been pushed out of either organization. Is that right so far?
Gosh, what can I say about that? What I can say is that we are hoping to get more on that would allow us to report some of what we already know. And so if anybody's listening to this who has not been, returning my calls, you really should. And I would love it if you did.
Well, I'll always return your calls. I'm so happy that you're doing the work you are, and you've just shown throughout this interview why you're a professional journalist, because you're not going to say necessarily what I want to hear, and you're going to give the point of view of the people that you're covering. No, I mean, that's why I wanted to talk to you. I knew that you were very professional and credible, and so is your work. People should go read all of your work along with Tim Marchman, your colleague there, an editor, as well as your book, which I'll get and read and hopefully talk to you soon. But man, you are the reason to support journalism and even at Vice specifically. I didn't mean even at Vice. I just meant at Vice specifically is what I meant. Sorry.
Vice has had a very interesting year, as anybody can tell you.
I won't ask you to comment on that on the record, but
yeah. Well, we were bought out of bankruptcy by some, weird agglomeration of people. So, maybe by the time this airs, my desk will have been replaced with another taxidermy bear or like a huge pallet of our terrible beer that we apparently sell. But for now, I'm working at Vice and I'm enjoying it very much. And I'm grateful to be able to do the work that I do.
If that's the case ever, then I will do whatever I can to make sure that you get funded independently, because there's not a lot of people who are as good as you are doing what you're doing. And it's so vitally important. And every major news organization should have several reporters like you on the beat. So thank you very much for talking to me, Anna. And let's do it again soon.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right, there she goes, Anna Merlan over at Vice News. Go give her a shout on social media, get her book, read her articles, and let me know what you think. And hopefully you'll give a review on Spotify and iTunes. You'll follow on youtube.com/standupwithpete, on Threads and all of the rest of the social media platforms. I'm generally Pete Dominic, and all those links to all of my stuff are in today's show notes. Thank you again for joining me, and I look forward to having you right back here tomorrow, where we're always trying to be the change that we want to see in the world. Thank you. Love you. Bye-bye. Happy birthday, Vicky Body Robinson.
When you can't see the forest for the burning trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. And even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for loss, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be froze up, you got to show up. Ain't no no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up and show obedience to the voice inside. And listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up